So welcome to this how-to video for the How to Learn Italian ebook. So basically the goal of this video is to show you how to get the most out of this guide, out of this ebook. So we'll go through it chronologically, go through the table of contents and how you can use each part of this guide. And I'll also cover the fundamental principles for learning languages so that you can get off to the best possible start with learning Italian. But of course, everything I cover in this video is covered in the ebook as well, so don't worry about taking notes if you don't want to. That's perfectly fine. You can just sit back and have a cup of tea or something and enjoy this video. So to start with, we'll go to the table of contents, and the guide is divided into 5 key parts: the overview, introduction to Italian, settling in, the path to fluency, and what next. So we'll go through each of these, but just to start with, you've got a couple of things in the top left here before you get started. So obviously, how to use this guide you've found already. Defining fluency, and why I started How to Learn Languages. Now that is just for anyone who's interested in, as it says, why I started How to Learn Languages. You don't need to read it, it's just, I know that for some things people have created, people like to read about, where it came from, why it started and stuff, so that's just there in case it's interesting or useful for you. And you might find it useful in terms of, I talk a bit about my experience figuring out how to learn languages, the experiences I had. But you don't have to read that part, it's just in case it's interesting for you. Now, defining fluency, as you can see, it's covered in the ebook, but just to quickly mention here for you, fluency isn't being able to speak Italian or, understand Italian at the level of a first language speaker, at the level of an Italian speaker. That is actually proficiency. So fluency is a level below, and it probably equates to somewhere in the B2 range of the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. B2 is a broad level, but it'd be somewhere in there, probably towards the higher end, I guess. And proficiency is, well, certainly C2, perhaps even C1. But that's covered in more detail in that section of the guide anyway, if you're interested. Now, the overview, sort of the first part of the guide, I'd recommend reading that, whether you're wanting to use this guide as a follow-along or as a reference tool, because the overview explains to you the fundamental principles for learning languages and some of the more controversial aspects of language learning and how to apply that to learning Italian, such as, whether you should study grammar in isolation or not, that sort of thing. And just in case you're curious right now, it's up to you with grammar. You can study it in isolation if you enjoy it, but if you don't have to at all. So I'd recommend reading the overview regardless of how you're wanting to use this guide. Now, as you'll see here, the contents is laid out in a number format and divided into chapters, sub-chapters, sections, so that if you want to use it as a reference tool, it's very easy to. You can find exactly what you're looking for and click onto it. But if you do enjoy reading, I would absolutely recommend using this book as a follow-along from cover to cover. But you don't have to if you're not a big fan of reading, that's fine. But either way, essential to read the overview. Now after that, we've got Introduction to Italian, which it's not essential you read it, but I would recommend reading it, of course. Certainly this part, the orientation, about alphabet and pronunciation and the head start. The reason I'd certainly recommend reading that part, regardless of how you want to use this guide, is that the alphabet and pronunciation are essential with any language, or the writing system of any language, and pronunciation is essential. And in that, I just explained some of the key points about the Italian alphabet and pronunciation, and then you've got links to a series of YouTube videos by fantastic channels for learning Italian, where you'll be able to actually hear the sounds of the Italian alphabet and the Italian language, which is essential. And below that you've got the Head Start. Now, this perhaps isn't essential, but I'd definitely recommend reading it, because when you read the Head Start you'll feel a lot of encouragement for the process, because Italian has a whole host of words that are shared with English basically. You know, the spelling and pronunciation might be slightly different, but when you see those words it's very clear that they are, you know, the same words you see in English. And in the Head Start I explain the most common word formats that are found in both English and Italian, and you know, there's a huge amount, so it makes learning Italian a much faster process than learning languages which have far less related words with English. Now I very briefly cover the historical reasons for that in the Head Start, but if you're interested in much more detail about the history of Italian, then I'd recommend reading the history section. Now, I'm sure all of you will want to, or anyone reading this, using this guide, will be itching to get on with the process of actually learning Italian, so don't feel, you know, that you need to read the history part straight away, but definitely at some point I'd recommend reading it, because it's going to give you a much deeper understanding of the Italian language, and you know, the stuff you read about in that part will crop up at times, you know, you wouldn't have been expecting it during the process of learning Italian. You know, you might be immersing or actively learning with Italian, and a word will crop up where you think, yeah, I read about that, and it's actually a Greek word that came into Latin thousands of years ago and then made its way into Italian, stuff like that. So it just makes the whole process a bit more enriching. Now of course you don't have to read that section at all, but yeah, I'd recommend it. And yeah, this part here at the start of Introduction to Italian, you don't have to read it, but you know, especially the defining Italian part, it's a good way just to get your bearings about, you know, the language, dialects, standard form of the language, that sort of thing. And the why learn Italian part, although, you know, the fact you've made it to this point means you've got a lot of motivation for learning Italian and are already familiar with your reasons for learning the language. When, you know, doing anything in life, learning anything in life, including learning a language, we always have days where, you know, our motivation just isn't there or isn't the same as usual. So when you're having a day like that, it might help to read the Why Learn Italian section, just to try get yourself back in gear with it and feel, you know, remotivated to learn the language. And just quickly on that, you know, it can be all sorts of reasons that have nothing to do with actually learning the language that can affect our motivation. So don't worry when you come across days where it's like that. Just try to keep on going with it, and you know, you'll get there. So yeah, that's Introduction to Italian. Before we go into the next two parts, which are, you know, the settling in period and the path to fluency, I'm just going to go back to the overview and the how to learn languages part, because it's very important to have an understanding of the fundamental principles for learning languages. Now, these are passive learning, active learning, and practice. So, passive learning, fortunately, it's, you know, arguably the most essential part of the process, but it's also the most convenient to follow, because, you know, as you see in the name, it's passive. So this is immersing in Italian, you know, when you're doing stuff where you don't need to be concentrating on the fact you're immersing in Italian. You know, you could be on the commute to work, you could be cooking, cleaning, doing exercise, you know, whatever comes to mind, and you can just be listening to Italian in the background. And because it's passive, you can build up hours and hours of this, and that's essential for learning the language. Now, a very important thing to mention at this point is that your passive learning has to be with forms of Italian that Italian speakers, i.e., you know, first language speakers, would listen to or read, because that is going to get you familiar with how the language is used and consumed by first language speakers as quickly as possible. You know, there's no point delaying that. The sooner you get used to that, the faster progress you'll make. And you know, so to highlight how essential that is, if you think of, you know, if you studied a language at school and didn't take it further after that, and you found that you might be able to read a little bit in the language, but you couldn't really speak it, and you certainly couldn't understand it when you heard it in real settings, that's because at school it's impossible for us to do the passive part of the process. So it's an absolutely essential ingredient, and you're often going to see on YouTube a lot of people going on about comprehensible input, and this can cause a lot of confusion with the passive part of the process. So, for example, you'll hear people say, oh, you've got to use comprehensible input, otherwise, you're wasting your time and stuff. And comprehensible input as a concept is basically using materials that you understand the majority of, say 70, 80, perhaps 90% of what you're listening to, for example, and there's say 10% you can't quite get. The theory behind it is because 90% of it, you'll be able to infer the meaning of the 10% you didn't understand, more or less. And as a concept, there's nothing wrong with that. That does make sense, and it's true to a point. But the reason I don't think in terms of comprehensible input is that it's quite misleading for people, especially when they're starting out learning a language, because it uses the term input. They think, I need to be immersing in stuff I can understand 90% of. That's just not a good way to learn languages at all in terms of the passive part of the process. The passive part, immersing, you don't need to be concentrating on the language. It's not important that you can't understand even anything of what you're listening to. In fact, that's exactly why you're listening to it, because you can't understand it. The more you listen to it, the more your brain will pick up the sound patterns. Now, just as a quick example on that, researchers did some research. I think it was in Barcelona, and they found that babies who were, I think, even just maybe a few days old, or certainly still very, very young, a matter of days, weeks, or even just a few months old, they played 2 languages to them. I can't remember which languages they were, but off the top of my head, I think it was Swahili and Turkish. And the babies were able to tell they were 2 separate languages. Now, of course, they had no idea what Swahili was, what Turkish was, but based on, I'm no scientist, but I think, they followed like the brain waves of the babies, like what was happening with their brains at the time, and these changed when they played a different language to them. And the inference was that the babies realised, or their brains realised, that at a certain point they were listening to a different series of sounds. So our brains, from basically the moment we're born, can pick up on sound patterns. So it's important you expose your brain to these sound patterns in Italian as soon as you start learning the language, and as often as you can. Unfortunately, with passive learning, because it's passive, you can accumulate many hours doing it on your commute, cleaning, cooking, exercise, etc. Now, the active part of the process is where comprehensible input can be very useful, and I'll get into why in just a moment. But basically, with active learning, when you strip it down at its most basic level, it is sentence collecting. And it could be called other words, chunking, sentence mining. You'll have probably come across some of these before. But basically, it's learning new phrases, and learning phrases in their entirety, not learning new words per se, in isolation. And the reason this is very effective is because you learn not only the new words in that phrase, but the grammar of that phrase, and depending on how you've collected the sentence or the phrase, you may even have developed an understanding of how you could use it in conversation. So, to quickly go back to the thing about grammar as well, you can study grammar in isolation if you want, but you don't have to. And studying grammar in isolation isn't part of your active learning. It's a separate thing you can do if you enjoy studying grammar. It's completely up to you, but you don't have to. Now, so with active learning, sentence collecting is the essential form of it. Now, you can do this in its most basic form of literally just going to YouTube, following videos with lists of phrases and noting them down, saying them aloud, practicing them with, first language speakers, with Italian speakers, and that's grand. And you can just do it like that if you prefer. However, if you want to make it a bit more interesting, you can do active listening and active reading, which are basically where you do active learning and collect phrases, by using materials that either Italian speakers would use or that have been designed for people learning Italian to learn new phrases. Now that's where comprehensible input can be fantastic, because you can find resources which are, broken down in, levels of progression for you to work through, and for each bit of content won't seem too daunting. You're just picking up the new parts, stuff like that. So for active learning, comprehensible input's fantastic. You don't need to think in terms of comprehensible input, because it's just not helpful as a concept for your overall approach. But if, for example, when you're looking for resources for active learning, you see a resource which says, this is comprehensible input, that's fine. For active learning, that's great, go ahead. But with active learning, just use any resources you find interesting, be it, a vlog by an Italian speaker that Italian speakers would listen to, where you're wanting to collect sentences from it, writing out a transcript from that vlog, or a newspaper article, whatever you can think of. If you enjoy it, then it's probably worth it for your active learning. And as long as you're, focusing on picking up the phrases in the content you're learning, then you're well on your way to developing your fluency in Italian. Now, one aspect of sentence collecting it's worth mentioning is sentence creating. Now, this is when you learn new phrases, collect new phrases, and try to create a new phrase from that phrase by swapping out a word, for example. This is very helpful, and I go into more detail in the ebook why. But for now, one caveat to mention with it is that it's essential you try out these sentences you create with Italian speakers so that you can get feedback, because not every phrase you create will be a phrase that Italian speakers would actually use, and that's fine. You can find out when you practice it with Italian speakers and they'll let you know, that's fine. Never be afraid to make mistakes and inverted commas. It's an absolutely essential part of learning a language, and indeed most things. So yeah, you don't even need to think of it in terms of mistakes, honestly. It's nothing to worry about. So the final essential part of learning any language is practice with Italian speakers, and this is absolutely essential for developing your fluency specifically, to get used to using the language automatically. Now, if you're a bit worried about talking with Italian speakers when you're starting out, or a bit shy, no worries. You can, think of scenarios in your head and think about how you might respond in Italian. It's not ideal, but it's a good compromise if you're wanting to build up your confidence a bit more first. But regardless of how you're feeling about it, I would recommend just getting into it as soon as you can, because it genuinely can be very enjoyable, getting to meet other people in their language, helping them with their English and stuff. It's a nice experience, or can be, and it will really help your Italian, most importantly. Now, another reason that makes practice essential is that it means you use the language, and using the language is the most effective way to remember what you learned during active learning. Now, even though practice and using it is the most effective way to remember, we do also cover in the guide other ways to remember the stuff you learn during active learning, such as, for example, I'll go back to the table of contents to show you, but we've got here, you'll see, so we've got SRS, which are spaced repetition systems. You'll have probably heard about these, like flashcard software. They can be very effective, but they have got some drawbacks, and they're not essential. You don't have to use them. I personally rarely do. I'm not a big fan. I find it a bit boring, but it's up to you. But in this section, this subchapter, you've got lots of other ways, like keeping a notebook, writing a diary, voice memos, chorusing, which is also very helpful for pronunciation. Like, for example, personally, when I learned Vietnamese, or was learning Vietnamese, actively learning Vietnamese, I just kept a notebook, didn't really do any flashcard stuff, and really enjoyed it. So just base it on personal preference and choose memory techniques you enjoy. So there's more detail in the guide, of course, but this combination of passive, active and practice will get you to fluency in Italian or any language. So just to work through a bit more of the guide with the settling in process, we cover, the essentials of listening to Italian, reading Italian for immersion, and that is to get you set up for this settling in period, which I recommend doing for anywhere between a few days to a few weeks even, just see how you're feeling. Now, the more time you spend doing that, the more familiar the language is going to seem when you start active learning and practice with Italian speakers, so it is very helpful for making it less of a shock when you start, I guess. But if, say, after a few days of just immersing in Italian, you find you're itching to get started with active learning and practice, then by all means do so. But if you are enjoying it and feel you can, you're not in too much of a rush, then a few weeks is great as well, because you're always building up a nice base for when you start active learning and practice. And you'll be continuing immersion throughout the whole process. It's not a case of finishing the settling in period and then just doing active learning and practice, but I personally think it's really helpful to just a few days to a few weeks build up a base of immersion before you get started with the rest of the process. So you can see here we cover how to fit this into a routine, but as mentioned, it's basically attaching it to stuff you already do for immersion. And you've got resources for immersion here with like YouTube, podcasts, etc., listed into categories and stuff, so that you can find content that's interesting for you. And the Learning Italian YouTube channels, obviously they're great for actively learning the language as well, for finding content for active learning. Now, just as an example, say you wanted to improve your cooking, but also immerse it in Italian, improve your Italian, there's channels like Cucina Botanica, and you can, so she's got a 3-minute recipe video here, and you can learn a new recipe whilst immersing in Italian, so it's a great way to...
Le verdure gratinate sono semplicissime da preparare, ottime in tantissime situazioni, se ne possono preparare diversi tipi insieme, insomma sono...
So there you go, you can listen to Italian whilst learning about stuff you're already interested in. So now going back to the table of contents, you can find resources there, and then once you've completed the settling in period, you can crack on with the path to fluency. And this is basically where you incorporate active learning and practice so that you're following passive, active and practice to reach fluency in Italian. Now we start by covering passive learning in a bit more detail than in the settling in period, so that you can really develop it to get even more out of it, such as, changing the device of the language of your devices or your phone, little tips and tricks like that. And then we get into a lot of detail about active learning. So for those of you wanting to use the guide as a reference tool, we've just got a quick overview of active learning here in bullet points. But then we go into much more detail about sentence collecting on a fundamental level, and the free resources and paid resources you can use to do that. And then we cover active listening and reading, which, as mentioned, is a slightly more engaging way to do sentence collecting, using content Italian speakers would use, or content designed for Italian learners. And we cover the theory behind that, but also lots of resources you can use to do so in that section, or that sub-chapter. And then, after that, how to remember what you learn, different memory techniques you can use to help remember what you're learning during active learning. And then you've got practice there, how to practice, different forms of practice, and the apps you can use to do so, such as Tandem and HelloTalk. But of course, if you are lucky enough to live in Italy or an Italian-speaking region or expat area, then you may be able to practice in person as well. Now, just a quick thing on remembering what you learn as well. It's very important to keep in mind that immersion and active learning and practice all complement each other in terms of remembering what you learn. There will be phrases and words you come across within the phrases you collect where you suddenly start noticing them during your immersion. So like the day before, it might have been a word that you hadn't really jumped out at you during your commute to work, for instance, but then the following day, after doing a bit of active learning, which happened to include that word or phrase, it will suddenly jump out at you during your commute to work, and vice versa. So they all complement each other and will really propel you forward with your Italian, and any language, of course. Now, putting it all together just shows you how to put all these elements into a routine for learning Italian, and obviously there's more detail in that section for you to read, but a key thing to mention now is that, you know, when you're putting plans together for, you know, your journey learning Italian in terms of, you know, your schedule, when you might immerse, when you might actively learn, etc., that can be great. And, you know, I personally like to make some form of plan here and there, but it's absolutely essential to be flexible about it, because, you know, all our lives, you know, our schedules change all the time, be it monthly, weekly, even daily sometimes. And so our schedules for learning a language also have to adapt with that. And yeah, I mention that now because, you know, there'll be times when you'll feel a bit frustrated that, you know, something else in your life, with work or whatever, is meaning you've got a bit less time to do Italian that day or that week, and it is frustrating, but just keep in mind it's a normal part of the process, and, you know, we just need to be flexible about how we learn the language in terms of our schedule. For example, I don't like planning in granular detail like I see some people do on YouTube with like all sorts of like Notion tables and spreadsheets and stuff, which are great if you want to do them, by the way. But what I do is I tend to just have a slightly more general plan, like on Apple Notes, and, you know, inevitably during the days, weeks and months as my schedule outside of learning a language changes, I have to adapt that plan as I go, and that's fine. So yeah, don't be afraid to be flexible. It's a very important part of putting everything together and keeping it going during the process. Now, the what next part is for when you've reached a certain level of fluency in Italian. It'll show you how to take the language further, how to keep improving. But the long and short of it is basically just to keep doing what you've been doing, although you probably won't really need to do much, if any, active learning from that point. You can just immerse and practice with Italian speakers to keep on improving. And yeah, another thing mentioned there is that, you know, because you'll have reached fluency, getting to proficiency, like the level of a first language speaker, it'll often come down to really taking time to immerse and look into, you know, Italian culture, history, social topics, that sort of thing, so that you can really understand the sort of things that first language speakers talk about, write about, listen to on a daily basis. And the last part of what next is just a bit about how to get your Italian level certified. I go into more detail in that section, but basically don't feel you have to do that if you don't have to, you know, unless you have to for work, study purposes, then it's up to you whether or not to get your Italian level certified or not. You may find it really enjoyable from like a personal motivation standpoint, but if not, don't feel any pressure to, because, you know, unless you have to get your Italian level certified for some reason, the most important part is that you'll have enjoyed the process of learning Italian. You know, so many things in life these days are because we have to do them, and so it can be nice to do something just for the sake of enjoying it now and again. And the great thing about learning a language is that it also happens to be something that can be really useful in all sorts of, all sorts of aspects of life as well. Now, the final part is just some tutorials about how to add audio to flashcards, should you wish to use flashcards. Overcoming challenges, I'd recommend going to that whenever you're either struggling for motivation or you've had to take a bit of a break from learning the language, which is fine. You know, you have to prioritise whatever you have to prioritise in your life. Don't worry if that's the case sometimes. And how to learn 2 languages at once. That, you know, once you've learnt Italian or a language, you may find yourself wanting to learn other languages, so that article or that section I've written might be helpful for you. Finally, just on images, if you see images you like in this book, here you'll find where they are in Italy and who took them, because they're from Unsplash. Contact, please feel free to email me at contact@howtolearnlanguages.info. I'll be happy to help you with any questions you might have, more than happy to help. And yeah, reviews, if you can go here and leave a review or email me a review, I'd be very grateful. So I think that covers everything, and enjoy learning Italian.